So at least to my naive eyes, what it looks like is that millions of people in this country don't have enough money to securely afford food, housing, education, and healthcare, while a few million others are like constantly gorging themselves on golden pizzas or something. But I'm guessing it's even worse than that, because it's not just that some people don't have enough money to meet all of their needs, it's that they have to be poor while other people are rich. And since people compare themselves to others, that leads to all kinds of additional anxieties and resentments and social tensions.
I can speak from first-hand experience that when I went through a period when I was rock bottom, I stupidly did the same thing. And I don't blame anybody else for that. I actually blame that on self-neglect. I failed to acknowledge the positives about myself. This, again, is a problem with an individual and their own mental health. It's not a rich person who makes you feel, so down about yourself. I know many people who have far less money and are perfectly happy and are, full of self-confidence, and they don't feel a care in the world about what other people own. You have your own responsibility over what you do with your own life. It's not their fault that you are poor. It's not their fault that you are, feeling so down. You have a life full of choices. Now, what I do stand in defence of people such as yourself for, government standing in the way through the economy basically prohibits much opportunity for the less fortunate to have more opportunity to get out of the mess that they're in. And it's the fault of all this socialist government interventionism. Now, I'm not going to sit here and point the finger and say, oh well, this is your fault. Right? I'm not going to do that because I'm going to be reasonable about this. This unfair system allows government to pick and choose winners and losers. So as a result of not living under a capitalist system, this unfair system gives advantage to the big corporations. Meanwhile, it uses the big heavy boot of government regulations and it weighs down the smaller competitors. Meanwhile, these people, these big corporations, are given special interest favours, because they've lobbied and they've paid off the politicians and they get away with what they're doing. People comparing themselves to other people, that's their own fault. It's nobody else's fault. They need to actually take responsibility over their own life to improve their own mental health. And you can even, seek out people who are psychologists who would tell you this. It's a grave mistake for you to, sit and project the blame off onto other people. If you are the one sitting in the position of comparing yourself to other people and continuing to go down that frame of mindset, you're the one who's going to end up miserable. And that's not anybody else's fault but your own.
There's a study of capuchin monkeys that shows if you reward one monkey for a task with a delicious grape and a monkey in the adjacent cage with a shitty cucumber, the monkey who gets the cucumber loses his shit. And if you do this to humans for long enough, they start building guillotines. But that's just how it looks to me. I could be wrong. I mean, I'm not an economic theorist, and honestly, I don't really understand how the economy works. I don't even check my own bank account balance very often. I make the videos, I swipe the card. So look, if I'm wrong and capitalism is good actually, just leave a comment and I'll be happy to be proven wrong. But before you do that, let's get some of the more obvious objections out of the way.
Income inequality exists because not everyone does the same jobs. Some people work harder than others, and those people deserve to make more money.
Well, sweatshop workers work really hard, and they barely make any money at all. And a lot of people who work minimum wage have to work multiple jobs just to sustain themselves and their families. It's actually a ton of work, and they barely make enough money to survive.
Those countries who currently go through working in these sweatshops is equivalent to what the British people had to do in order to get to where we are at today. That is to say that at one period in our history, our people had to go from, working on the agricultural landscape with practically nothing, working for dirt poor wages, then went into working in the factories, working for hard hours in poor conditions. The factories actually paid substantially more, and continuously year in, year out, their living conditions, their working conditions were continuously improving, their working hours were reducing, because again, as more technology would be invented, you would see multitasking, you would see, things being done at a quicker rate. For example, you could contrast people working in the fields in the agricultural landscape in the 1700s using their hands, and contrast that to the type of stuff that you have today, the machinery that you have today. It's remarkable how much these machines have reduced working hours in many regards, that enabled people to improve their material standards of living. So the point that I'm getting at here is the fact that if it wasn't for those sweatshops, they wouldn't have been able to improve their material standards of living and wealth. And that is what these extremely poor countries are having to go through. If they didn't have access to that, they wouldn't be able to get to where we are at today. I understand that it's not exactly wonderful, but see, if they didn't have that, they'd be dying of starvation. And it's not a case that you can just go from A to Z overnight. The minimum wage argument is destructive. Like I explained earlier about the $15 minimum wage, and it's quite funny actually, because you actually gave an example to say that you would never buy the pizza for $2,000 because you don't value the pizza for $2,000.
There's this kind of sadness that sets in as they realize that the $2,000 pizza isn't worth it at all. To fully understand why a $2,000 pizza is not worth it, you have to understand it in the context of capitalism. The price, $2,000, tells you the exchange value of the pizza, and if you live in America, you have an instinctive sense for what that means, because you know all the other things you could buy with $2,000.
Well, that's the same principle as, if you raise the minimum wage to $15, no one's going to value employing someone to flip £5 burgers or $5 burgers for, $15 an hour or £15 an hour. Again, it relates to supply and demand. If you push the price up of the lower skilled worker, the demand from the employer falls. The reason for why you're arguing for the increase of the minimum wage, and I can understand why you would support it, but your argument for doing so is because, look at the costs of living. If you raise the minimum wage, what are companies going to do in order to compensate paying for the minimum wage? They're going to raise the costs of their goods and services, aren't they? Or, of course, they will reduce working hours. They might, do away with the full-time workers and get more part-time workers. And although that might look like there's more employment and employment goes up, what you see in effect is fewer working hours. Employers will do things to compensate other ways to pay for that, to be able to afford to pay for the $15 or £15 an hour. Hong Kong never had the minimum wage up until 2010.
As these city-states have among the worst income inequalities in the world.
What he's really basically saying is he's not interested in that improvement. He doesn't pay attention to the very fact that the poor, the bottom 20% today, in the likes of Hong Kong and Singapore, are far richer today than what they were in the 1950s. So he's not interested in that real world improvement. Another thing to point out, and I've mentioned this before, when you talk about the wealth gap, the bottom 20% today is not the same bottom 20% a decade ago or a decade before that. Over a time period, the bottom 20% changes. It's not fixed. If you look at from 1948, when Hong Kong had an average household income of less than $900 per year, to 1997 when it sat with an average household income greater than $37,000 plus. How did it achieve that? With no minimum wage. Because the minimum wage is not a requirement. It's not how you improve people's wages.
So let me get this straight. You criticize capitalism and yet you yourself make money on the internet. Hypocrite much?
A few years ago, I was a broke philosophy graduate student, and when I criticized capitalism then, people used to say,
Why don't you stop whining and get a real job and earn a living? You just resent capitalism because you're too lazy to put in the work it takes to succeed.
so if people who are failing under capitalism can't criticize it because they're just resentful, and people who are succeeding under capitalism can't criticize it because they're hypocrites, then, according to you, is anyone allowed to criticize capitalism?
There's nothing wrong at all with that of criticising capitalism, and people are more than welcome to. And at the end of the day, there is no such thing as a perfect system, and capitalism is not perfect. It does have its faults, such as, for example, there's no such thing as perfection in economics. You will always have exploitation to some degree or another, or corruption to some degree or another. What isn't rational, what is irrational, is then turning to socialism for the answer to solving your problems. You have argued for a system pertaining to money and people getting paid wages, as far as I'm concerned, because you are arguing along the lines to do with the minimum wage, etc. I imagine that you are someone who does agree with a money-based system. But here's the issue. Where are you going to get the money from? If you can't get it from the private sector, because as far as I'm concerned, you would wish to get rid of the private sector. So if you get rid of the private sector, where are you going to get the money from? Because you've only got the printing press. And throughout recorded history, everywhere that's attempted to run the printing press has resulted in hyperinflation, and that is 100%. It's not even a question of if, but, or a maybe. It's 100% certainty that you would hit hyperinflation as a result of running the printing press. You're allowed to criticise capitalism, but the problem is, the fault is, you're blaming the wrong system. You're actually blaming the problems that you have today on capitalism, when the problems that you have today was to blame on socialism.
Okay, but I like stuff.
I like stuff too. I think a lot of people have this instinctive fear that if capitalism goes, so does everything we love. I mean, when I think of communism in particular, I think of austerity, scarcity, conformity, undrinkable victory gin, the end of fashion, all art required to be propaganda, just an all-around nightmare situation for a person of my persuasion. And it's not for no reason at all that I have these anxieties, since there was an aspect of that to some past communist societies. But the stuff I'm worried about, booze, makeup, art, baths, these things existed long before capitalism, and they'll exist long after it.
Capitalism has been around a lot longer than the name it was coined to be. Capitalism in its old form was known as meritocracy, and capitalism in many regards has been around the argument since the days of the ancient Greeks, when they argued over individualism and collectivism. This goes way back to the days of Aristotle, etc. Capitalism in its earliest form goes way back to when you first saw trade in the world, because that's what capitalism is. The idea of capitalism itself didn't really come around in the 18th century.